Okay, so we are getting to now the third phase of the civil rights movement, and we're going to try to figure out what some of the accomplishments and limitations were of the civil rights movement in the mid 20th century. So the third phase runs from about 1965 to 1970. Let's get down there. We've gone through a lot. Okay. After Freedom Summer and after the results of the 1964 Democratic National Convention, many of the younger students who were active in the struggle had really started to become more disillusioned with the very slow, limited success of what nonviolence was producing. And so what they began to do was to really reject pretty much everything that King had stood for. So they began to reject nonviolence and begin to see violence as a solution. They begin as well to reject King's Christianity and that sort of how he had infused that into the movement. And, you know, a lot more people were starting to feel like the students as well, disillusioned and angry, you know, especially as it seemed that whites who murdered blacks and bombed churches and broke the law pretty much were escaping punishment without, you know, any kind of meaningful punishment, certainly. So what we see happening with the third phase is, again, it's sort of rejecting that element of Christianity, rejecting that element of nonviolence, and sort of going in a very different direction because they're beginning to think now that nothing has worked, what has been done before. And a part of this fragmentation is what becomes the Black Power movement. Again, initially, the civil rights movement had been pushing for wanting integration into white society and wanting, you know, to sort of, you know, become unified. The Black Power movement is going to change that, and there's going to be a lot more bigger emphasis on separatism, sort of wanting blacks to be separate and kept separate for certain reasons. We'll talk about that in a second. One really big influence in this change was a man named Malcolm X, who's the picture of right here. Malcolm X, whose original name was Malcolm Little, he switched the Little for X as he got older. He was making a statement about wanting his own last name rather than his, as he referred to it, his slave name of Little. He was born in Michigan in 1925. He was the son of a Baptist minister named Earl Little. Earl Little had been had worked with Marcus Garvey, who was a very prominent black nationalist, Pan-Africanist in the early 20th century. Had been someone who was very outspoken for sort of black nationalism and black pride in the early part of the 20th century. Malcolm's dad was murdered by white terrorists when the boy was only about 6 years old. His mom suffered a nervous breakdown because of that, and the kids were sent out to foster homes. Malcolm refused to stay in his foster home. He ran away to the east, where he becomes a criminal in New York, Boston. He's selling drugs, he's stealing, he's running prostitutes, all kinds of stuff. He was arrested and sent to prison in Boston. And it was while he was there that his life really began to change. He converted to being a black Muslim, which at the time was part of an organization called the Nation of Islam. This is not the Muslim faith, sort of strictly speaking. It takes elements of that, but it's not, you know, a sort of exact representation of Islam. The black Muslim faith was led at the time by a man named Elijah Muhammad. And the black Muslims were preaching a version of Islam that was very sort of black nationalistic. In other words, like at the time, Elijah Muhammad was preaching that whites were a satanic race sent by God, sent by Allah to punish blacks, but that the day of judgment for those white people was near, and that they were about to get what was coming from them, for them. Anyway, Malcolm is very attracted to this black Muslim faith and to these ideas of black nationalism, which basically means sort of having black people having their own area and their own country, and having pride in who they are, and knowing and having pride in their history, and being able to express that and know about that, and sort of celebrate racial differences rather than want to become like whites. So Malcolm, very attracted to this, after getting out of prison, he begins speaking to people. He begins leading the conversion of a lot of different blacks to the Muslim faith. He became, in fact, so popular that Elijah Muhammad became very jealous and ordered his assassination in 1965. He published an autobiography, which came out. And so although he was not alive during the actual third phase of the civil rights movement, during the Black Power movement, he himself was not alive, but his ideas and his autobiography became extremely influential, and something that all of them really were very tuned into. He really believed, up until like right before his death, that blacks and whites should be separate, that blacks and whites could not work together, that it was up to blacks to solve the civil rights movement, that they couldn't have whites working, which is very different from what King had always said. Anyway, but his autobiography becomes very, very important. Malcolm X and his ideas are going to cause, as well as some other factors, are going to cause SNCC to split, that main group that we talked about, student group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC continued to be a main group, but again, they really kind of split over a couple of different issues, over ideas that became so controversial within the group that it just caused the breakup. The first idea was racial. Some in SNCC felt that whites had a legitimate place within the struggle for civil rights, that whites had a role to play and that they could do something. Others, really, black members often really resented white tendencies to assume leadership roles, to sort of dominate meetings. And a lot of them really felt that this should be a black-led movement, and that it should be, something that black people do and not white people. So what we see around 1965 is that SNCC is going to split, and that whites, who had always been a part of the organization from the very beginning, that whites were excluded from the group in favor of black members and black leaders only. So racial issues are going to split. SNCC is going to become all black. But in addition to that, the attitudes of many of the men in SNCC, and many of the men in the civil rights movement in general, over women's roles and positions began to concern a lot of female members. So we're going to have a gender split as well. A lot of Freedom Summer really had a lot of sexism. And the young women who were working in Freedom Summer began to become very aware of their inequality within the movement. In other words, a lot of the men within Freedom Summer would not let the women lead meetings. They would not let the women go speak because they thought it was too dangerous. So they were keeping women from doing a lot of stuff. And this really made them angry and frustrated, because they were putting their lives on the line, and they were as committed as the men, and they wanted to be treated equally and to have equal roles and positions. And so they started to become very angry and frustrated. The men would make them clean up the houses that everyone was staying at. They forced the women to be the secretaries rather than the leaders of the group, so just to write down the minutes. And again, they got very frustrated about that. A group of women got together a document to try to lay out some of these concerns, and wanted the group to address these concerns. And they had a big discussion about it, and there was a lot of kind of back and forth. Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the leaders of the movement, was asked by someone, they'd taken a break, and someone asked Stokely, what is the proper position for women in the civil rights movement? And he replied, prone. In other words, lying down. So Stokely Carmichael expressed the view, and this was not uncommon either, that women should be sex objects for the men within the civil rights movement, and that men should be dominating. And this led to a lot of increased tension, as you might imagine, between men and women, which basically led to women in leaving the group in droves. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some women who stayed. There were quite a few women who were very prominent and very vocal and very influential. But many women began to leave after that. So SNCC splits up because of these debates about race and gender within the movement. What you start to see as well is some of that disillusionment and frustration really kind of coming out with other black groups as well. One of the sort of fringe groups within the Black Power movement was the Black Panthers. So they were kind of the extreme group of Black Power. Stokely Carmichael was a member of this as well. And the Black Panthers they really saw themselves, I guess, as a new organizing center. They sort of saw themselves as the military arm of a black revolution. They thought that a black revolution was about to happen and that blacks were about to take over and that they needed this military arm. So they sort of saw themselves and presented themselves this way. So here are a couple of pictures. They were wearing black leather. They carried weapons. They kind of looked like this elite paramilitary sort of unit, which is, what they thought of themselves. So the Black Panthers were sort of basically rehearsing for a black revolution and sort of seeing it like that. Now, obviously, these kind of views and these kind of ideas are not going to go unnoticed by whites in power, who had thought of King as threatening in the 1950s and the students as threatening earlier in the 60s, and now they're certainly going to see the Black Panthers as really threatening to America. So the FBI is going to begin investigating the Black Panthers. They became the objects of extensive surveillance. They would have black FBI agents or other people come in and infiltrate, and they were eventually crushed and driven out of existence. Not the least of which was that the Black Panthers were willing to use violence if necessary, and go through these frequent shootouts with the police, which started to kill off part of their leadership or cause them to run to go underground. Other things happening like that. So the Black Panthers form again because of this increasing frustration and rage and disillusionment with the civil rights movement. One of the things that sort of fed the Black Panthers and fed the Black Power movement quite a bit was that we start to see this disillusionment coming to urban areas as well and becoming very widespread. Here's a couple of other pictures of the Black Panthers. And if you've probably heard stories, this is the 1968 Olympics where you had a couple of African Americans raise their fists, which was a sort of symbol of Black power, and they had their medals stripped for doing that. So again, one of the things that we start to see with this disillusionment is that it's not just in the Black Panthers, but that it is starting to be among urban areas and urban neighborhoods as well. We see in the mid to late 1960s, beginning in 65, widespread rioting across the nation in urban areas. In fact, every major urban area in the United States had some sort of riot beginning in 65 to 69. The first major one of these was in Watts. These are pictures from Watts, which was a black area of Los Angeles. This was in August of 1965 when violence broke out. In LA, whites had been experiencing a lot of very good times for a while and had been improving in economic situation. The reverse was true for African Americans. Black citizens were actually worse off there than ever before. Their income had been dropping rather than rising. About 30% of the black men in the area were unemployed. They were in extreme poverty and could not purchase cars. I don't know if you've ever been to LA, but you pretty much have to have a car to be able to get around. So they were kind of trapped in this area. The jobs that were available in Watts were available through whites. They were white-owned businesses, not black-owned businesses. And the whites would discriminate against black people by charging higher prices, by having lower wages when they did hire black people. So all of this, and the police treatment was very poor and very antagonistic in Los Angeles. There was a lot of corruption and violence at this point. But there was, so we have this really sort of bad, intense economic situation and racial differences, and then also issues with the police. So over the summer of 1965, the Watts riot broke out. It was sparked by the police pulling over some black teens and, arresting them in a move that was just seen as indicative of, the bad treatment that the police were giving them. Riots began to break out. 34 people were killed. 4,000 were arrested by the time the riots got over. Much of the area had been burned down. So these are some pictures of what the scenes looked like. So, and again, this is going to continue through the 1960s. You're going to continue to see events like this and these massive amounts of rioting and destruction through urban areas in both the North and the South, by the way, through the 1960s. This is indicative of the level of frustration and anger that we see in the black community at this time, that they felt that working through traditional methods, that working within the system just wasn't working for them and was not getting anything done. And they felt that the only way that they could have their voice heard was through these methods. So it's really an indication of frustration and anger that we see this kind of reaction taking place. Okay, so what I want you to sort of pay attention to is the massive amount of change. We basically talked about 15 years, from about 1954 to about 1970, 15 or 16 years. The massive amount of change that happens through these first, second, and third phases. We go from Martin Luther King and talking about passive resistance and nonviolence to the Black Panthers, who are having shootouts with the police and these massive riots across the United States. Before we finish, let me also mention, because I don't want to leave with the impression that the Black Panthers or Black Power was all just, burn it down kind of thing. The Black Panthers did a lot of very positive stuff. Particularly, they were very influential around San Francisco. They began breakfast programs for kids in San Francisco, which began addressing some of the widespread poverty among African American and other communities. So they began breakfast programs for kids. They also began working on prison reform and informing people about how horrible prison conditions were and working to change those. In addition, as we start to move more into the later 60s, with a lot of the male leadership either in jail or on the run, the Black Panthers, the female leadership began to come out a bit more. And so you see people, that women that are coming out to the forefront and being very influential as well with some of their programs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. And there are quite a few. The civil rights movement was really a powerful kind of thing. The first thing was that the activism of the civil rights movement cut Jim Crow down at its knees. It cut Jim Crow, legalized segregation down at its knees. Segregation was not legal anymore, and we have legislation coming out of that. The most major piece is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This piece of legislation was vitally important. It does several things. The first thing it does is it forbids discrimination in race in any public accommodation. So it's going to go way beyond what Brown did. Brown was just about schools, desegregating schools, right? Public schools. The Civil Rights Act forbids discrimination by race in any public accommodation. It also outlawed discrimination in employment by race, religion, national origin, or sex. All of those things, by the way, had been legal before 1964. If you wanted to say, I'm not hiring this person because they're a woman, or I'm not going to promote this woman because they're a woman, you could do that, or because they're black. There was nothing to prevent that kind of discrimination in the workforce before. So now with this act, you can no longer have separate criteria for hiring, promotion, pay, any of those kinds of things. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, again, still around today. The EEOC was created to enforce this part of the legislation, to enforce this anti-discrimination in the workplace part of the legislation. And finally, the Civil Rights Act authorizes the Justice Department to enforce voting rights for minorities. Again, the states weren't doing it. In fact, the states were responsible for some of the problems. So people needed the federal government to go in and protect the registration of voters. So that's the Civil Rights Act. Again, extremely important. The other really big accomplishment of the Civil Rights Movement was that it greatly increases black political participation. It removes a lot of obstacles that were in voters' paths, that had been set up directly to impede black voter registration. There were several things in particular that really helped. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1964, made the poll tax illegal and unconstitutional in any national election, so you no longer can have poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests, so you can't have those anymore. In addition, it gave the Attorney General, so the National Attorney General, the Federal Attorney General, the power to supervise registration in any state where fewer than 50% of a group was registered. So in other words, they would know that there was a problem. If they went into Mississippi and only 10% of black people were registered to vote, obviously there was something weird and wrong going on. So the Attorney General could come in and help register people to vote. Because of all of this legislation, because of these things that were happening, massive amounts more African American voters are going to come into the system. Let me give you some examples of how much things are going to shift. In Texas, in 1960, 35% of all black adults were registered to vote, so 35%. By 1968, once these things have started to go into effect, it was up to 83%. So we go from 35 to 83% in Texas. In Alabama, and you're going to start off a lot lower because racial restrictions were a lot stronger here in Alabama. In Alabama in 1960, only 14% of black adults were registered to vote. By 1868, it had jumped to 60%, so not as good as Texas, but much, much better. So, one of the things that we do see is that legalized segregation is gone, and that voting participation is way up. Now, of course, there are going to be some limitations to what the civil rights movement did. We know first and foremost that it doesn't completely eliminate racism. We see that today in society. It is still a huge issue today. It is still something that we deal with quite a bit as a society. Another thing that it failed to do, they never really took up, although King, when he was assassinated, was sort of getting ready to start some of this. But the civil rights movement did not address economic inequality. It looked at social and political inequality. It really did not do much at all with economic inequality. Again, King was kind of working in that direction when he was murdered. A disproportionate number of blacks and other minorities suffer from poverty. This problem is just a lot harder to sort of sweep away and deal away, these economic issues. Certainly we also still see problems within the justice system, that justice is not meted out equally, that African Americans get harsher punishments for the same crime, longer prison terms, those kinds of things. We still see a lot of racial violence within the United States, and we've seen upticks in that recently. Again, so what we're having to think about is that economically and within the justice system in particular, there are still very huge pockets of problems and just the existence of racism too that the civil rights movement didn't address. However, there were some really good accomplishments that came out of it. I don't want to leave you on a horrible note. Again, what I wanted y'all to get out of this was an understanding of the origins of the civil rights movement, how the civil rights movement changed over time, and then also what it accomplished. So just let me know if you have any questions.